Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining. It's a nice turnout here. I'm going to do a couple slides. I'm not a huge slide believer, so I'm going to try and spend most of my time in the demo. And I'm also, I'm going to be looking at the chat window, so feel free to put in questions or whatever, and I'll try and address them, as I see them, or I have like a dedicated Q&A time at the end. So anything that I don't get to during the kind of the live portion, we'll just go back and do the Q&A. So just feel free to type stuff into the chat. Zoom has like a Q&A feature, but I actually don't like it because it's weird. So chat is where it's at for this webinar. Okay, cool. And I also don't know that we're really going to take a whole hour. I would love to be able to give you a little time back, so I'll try and make this efficient, but also exciting, informative, and educational. Okay, so the webinar is called Mission Critical Linkerd with Buoyant Cloud. I'm going to tell you a little bit. Let's see, where's my agenda? Here we go. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my favorite subject, which is me. Then I'm going to talk just 1 or 2 slides about Linkerd. Hopefully everyone is more or less familiar with it, but I'll give you the big picture view. And then of course, we're going to dive into Buoyant Cloud, and I'm going to, like I said, spend most of my time on a demo. And yeah, put your questions in chat if you have any. All right, so you can see I got a little bored last night and decided to annotate my picture. Hello, I'm William Morgan. I'm CEO of Buoyant. I'm one of the creators of Linkerd back in the olden days. So my contributions, over the past couple of years have been limited basically to docs and to README changes. So I'm not really writing any of the code anymore. And of course, I'm a frequent demo giver. I've been service meshing for longer than most. Linkerd was the very first service mesh, and it came out of some experiences that myself and my co-founder at Buoyant, Oliver Gould, had at Twitter. We were both engineers at Twitter, and Twitter went through this very big kind of microservices transformation, from 2010 to around 2015, at the same time that a lot of other companies were doing this. And a lot of those lessons turned into that very first version of Linkerd. At some point, I wrote an article on InfoQ about the history. Linkerd has gone through 2 major versions. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Everything that we've been talking about for the past couple of years has been the 2.x branch of Linkerd. If you are interested in ancient history, just search for that InfoQ article from me. So like lessons learned from the service mesh or something. Okay, so Linkerd, if you didn't know, it is a service mesh. It's ultra light, it's ultra fast. I'll talk a little bit about that. A whole lot of adopters from all over the world, and a wonderful community that we are very fortunate to have, a friendly and exciting people. It's been in production for over 5 years. Like I said, it was a first service mesh, so it's been around the longest. Very healthy Slack channel, lots of GitHub stars, of course, very important. We have weekly edge releases. Almost every week we manage to get an edge release out, so we move pretty fast, and we'll give you lots of opportunities to beta test it for us. It's a CNCF project, open governance, and as of a few weeks ago, we're finally a CNCF graduated project. So that's the top tier of the maturity scale for CNCF, so very exciting for us. And a big thank you to everyone in the community who was a part of making that possible. I'm going to give you a very quick rundown, and then this is kind of the last bit that I'm going to talk about Linkerd. There's a lot, a lot more to say, but for the majority of this, I really want to focus on Buoyant Cloud and what it does and its relationship to Linkerd. And I'm going to kind of assume that you more or less understand Linkerd. If that's not the case, then I apologize. You may have to go watch some other videos first and then come back to this one. So just the past couple of releases, 2.9 was the focus there was on MTLS everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean all TCP connections in your cluster. 2.9 also added ARM support. And we're going to talk about MTLS a fair amount in this video. 2.10, we added multi-cluster TCP. So now, and we also added opaque ports. So basically the theme here was all traffic can go through Linkerd. All cross-cluster traffic as well as in-cluster traffic can now go through Linkerd. We also added this idea of extensions, and we reduced the core control plane of Linkerd to be the minimal set. So that's the latest stable version. So I'm not going to talk too much about multi-cluster here, but if you are interested in running multiple Kubernetes clusters and having those services communicate across those clusters, then we have a really, really nice solution for you with Linkerd. And then, I said next month because I wrote these slides yesterday. It's now this month. So later this month, September 2021, we're going to have the 2.11 release. We should be entering RC territory pretty soon with our edge releases. And the focus here is finally on authorization policy. So up until now, if service A has tried to talk to service B, Linkerd has done its best to make that happen, like no matter what the obstacles were. As of 2.11, you're going to be able to say, no, that's not allowed to happen. So that's a pretty big shift for Linkerd and all sorts of exciting stuff. All right, 2.12 and beyond. So that's still kind of in the planning stages. Mesh expansion is a big topic for us. So getting the data plane to run outside of Kubernetes. More types of policy. So that authorization policy that we're adding in 2.11, we can extend that finally to things like rate limiting, circuit breaking, maybe route-based policy. So still in the planning stages there, but there's a lot of exciting stuff in the works for Linkerd. Okay, so enough about Linkerd. Let's talk a little bit about Buoyant Cloud. So, Buoyant Cloud is not open source. I guess I should make that really clear, right? Buoyant Cloud is a SaaS application. So this is now, kind of a pretty different beast from Linkerd, which of course is open source. And because it's a SaaS application also means that you don't have to run it, right? So Linkerd runs on your cluster and kind of you are responsible for its care and feeding. Buoyant Cloud runs happily off, and someone else's servers, and you don't have to worry about it. But it's designed, of course, to work with Linkerd because it's from Buoyant, the company that created Linkerd, and the company that still invests the majority of its resources in Linkerd. So what is Buoyant Cloud? It's a SaaS application designed to make Linkerd even better. And the way I think of it is it has two jobs. The first job is we want to make Linkerd even easier to run. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we also want to make, Buoyant Cloud wants to make Linkerd even more awesome. So on the easier to run side, a lot of the focus for Buoyant Cloud is on reducing the operational burden of running a service mesh, right? So can you run Linkerd without being a service mesh expert? Can you run it? Can you install it and then just not have to worry about it at all, right? That's the challenge for us. And then, of course, make Linkerd even more awesome. Linkerd has so much information about your system. There's so many things it can do. How can we harness all of that to solve problems for you? And Buoyant Cloud has a free tier. And one thing that was really important to us was that that free tier was actually valuable and functional and not like, the scraps that you have at that drop off the table, right? So even the free tier should be useful. Okay, is this making sense so far? If anyone's confused, just type "I am confused" into the chat. And then I don't know what I'll do, but at least I'll know. All right, so like I said, most of what I want to do is go through the demo. So make Linkerd even more awesome. I just have a few more slides and then we'll get right into demo time, right? So Linkerd has some amazing information about your system, right? The way that Linkerd works, of course, is it inserts a little proxy alongside every single pod or every meshed pod. And that proxy, of course, proxies all the TCP communication to and from that pod. And as part of that, it instruments everything about those calls. So it has a wealth of metrics and data about your services and about all the traffic in your cluster. Not just things like golden metrics, but also things like TCP metrics, byte levels and connections and things like that, all of which are very useful for diagnosing any kind of issue, especially networking issues in your system. And Linkerd also has that information, not just at the kind of the service level, but at the level of the connections between services. So when A talks to B, Linkerd measures that call, instruments it, and it knows the success rate, not just of B, but also of the call from A to B and of that particular call. So if you're calling the foo endpoint versus the bar endpoint, right? Those are two different behaviors, and you could have one call that's failing and one that's succeeding, right? All of that data is available to us. And Linkerd, kind of puts it out there, and it's kind of up to you to do something interesting with it. So we'll see what we do in Buoyant Cloud. A lot of information about traffic, including the TLS status across your cluster. So we'll dig into that a little bit in Buoyant Cloud. And then there's also rollout information, which is not strictly from Linkerd, but from Kubernetes. So often when you're making changes to a system, right, those changes have implications, and you can correlate changes to your application with changes to metrics and vice versa. So overall, we want to give you the tools with Buoyant Cloud to make your platform faster and better and more secure. Okay, so that was one, that was one of the two jobs. The other job, of course, is making Linkerd easier to run. So Linkerd is known for its operational simplicity, especially for, known for its simplicity, especially operational simplicity, right? So what that means is you as a human being who has to run the service mesh, you have a burden, right? All software has a burden. You've got to monitor it, you've got to alert on it, you've got to, wake up when it breaks, if it breaks. And that's what we want to minimize it. In Linkerd, of course, we try and minimize it as much as possible through this idea of simplicity. And if you've ever seen, there's a great talk by Rich Hickey about the difference between easy and simple. And our focus with Linkerd is not on easy, but it's on simple, right? And what that means is making every component of Linkerd something that you can understand, something that's clear, something that's obvious, make the connections between them logical, surface all of that, so you can build a mental model of how Linkerd works, right? And that is core to Linkerd's adoption, right? Like that is the reason why people come to Linkerd, because they can understand it. You want a service mesh, and you want it to be understandable and simple. But like I said, running Linkerd, like any software, is still hard. So can we make, with Buoyant Cloud, can we make Linkerd actually I'm calling it a zero brain operation. I don't know if that's a great term. I just came up with it. Okay, so those are our two jobs. I'm about to give a demo. Before I do that, just want to say we also make it really easy to connect Linkerd to Buoyant Cloud. So any Linkerd cluster can be connected to Buoyant Cloud. The easiest way, in my opinion, is to use the Buoyant Cloud Linkerd extension. So, you type in these commands over here. You can also obviously go to buoyant.io/cloud, sign up, and follow the instructions, and we'll walk you through the process. So any Linkerd cluster out there, any Linkerd 2.x cluster, I should say, can be connected to Buoyant Cloud in a very easy way. Okay, with that out of the way, hopefully your mind is now prepared for demo time, and you're just going to have to give me a few seconds to switch over the sharing. So give me 1 second here. Okay, hopefully you can now see this beautiful application in front of us. If you can't see it, then type in something into the chat so that I know that you can't see it. All right, I don't see any mean messages, so we're probably okay. All right, so here we are. Here is Buoyant Cloud, and in this little demo environment, I call it a demo environment, but it actually is a production system that we're looking at. And I'm going to walk you through. There's a lot here. I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, so where we're starting now, of course, is this is the overview page, right? And so you can see we actually have connected two clusters here, one called Prod East, one called Prod West. And they're actually, both running Linkerd, but they're running two different versions. So the Prod East cluster is running 2.10.2, the latest stable release, and the Prod West is living on the, edge, running the Edge 21.8.4. So that was, I think, the most recent Edge release. And actually, you can see here something really interesting. This Prod West cluster, while the control plane is 21.8.4, the data plane is a mix. Okay, and that's pretty common for anyone who has run Linkerd for a while and has gone through upgrades. It's pretty common to have multiple data plane versions running. And of course, this is one of the things that we want to give you the tools to manage. So what else can we see? Well, we can see our total traffic throughout the system, okay, and total CPU usage. There's a lot of metrics in here that I'm going to dive into. We can see that overall, our application's running about 80 cores, Linkerd in total is consuming 1 core, and our app's running at 300 gigs, and Linkerd is consuming, 1.3% of that at 4 gigs. And then, actually, which is not uncommon, we have more unmeshed pods than meshed pods. So the point of this screen is this is the at-a-glance view of my Linkerd deployment across all of my clusters, right? So if I have 100 clusters, if I have 2, if I have 1, doesn't matter. This is my mesh kind of overview. And the one thing that's in here, that is empty right now is this little section at the bottom that says no ongoing controller data plane issues detected. So right now it's saying, hey, everything's healthy, right? But we can actually look in the past, and we can see some of the issues that happened here. So we can see a couple events that fired in the past for some of these clusters. The first is this event we have here about the issuer certificate, right? So one of the things that Buoyant Cloud does is it monitors all of your TLS certificates, and it tells you and warns you ahead of time, hey, this certificate's about to expire, right? So that's a common operational issue, and it's very annoying to be caught with an expired certificate, because then you have to scramble before Linkerd will work again. TLS is very strict. Turns out TLS is very, very strict about expiration. When it says the certificate expires, it really means it. But Buoyant Cloud will monitor that, and it'll warn you, and it'll give you, plenty of time to rectify the situation. You can see we had a couple other interesting events fire. So at some point, the destination service of the Prod West cluster had a success rate of less than 99%. Lasted 22 minutes. That was marked as a Sev2. And let's see if we find, okay, so we see kind of a history of that destination service. So you can imagine there's other events in here that I don't think we fired, but Buoyant Cloud, one of the things that it does, it's monitoring each of those kind of best practices on all the control plane components, setting up a pre-configured set of alerts, and then those alerts can be delivered to you, right? So they can wake you up if you want them to wake you up at 3 in the morning. You can do that. In this case, I just have this one very simple rule here, which says anything that's Sev1, send me an email, but we can imagine, connecting this to PagerDuty or OpsGenie or Slack or whatever it is. Okay, so that's enough of the overview page. Let's dive in, so we can actually look at our control plane. Again, this is across all clusters, and we can look at our control plane components. Again, we see Prod East is 2.10.2, West is 21.8.4, edge release. We can sort all of these control plane components by, success rate and whatever. This is usually a pretty boring page because the control plane components are either, at 100% or something terrible has happened and they're at 0%. Sorting by RPS maybe is a little more interesting, but this is kind of the sanity check. Yes, I have all these control plane components. Everything's okay. The data plane page is a little more interesting, right? Because here we're going to look at all the proxies across all of your clusters, and we're going to give you a way of understanding what those are, right? So we can see that, we've got 83 mesh pods on this east cluster, 51 on the west, and across all these 134 proxies, right? We can actually do interesting stuff now, right? So for one thing is we can sort them by memory usage. Right? We can say, okay, these ones on this Nginx ingress controller are the ones that are taking the most, right? Almost 100 megs, woo, giant by Linkerd standards, not giant by Envoy standards, but giant by Linkerd standards, and then kind of on the other extreme there, we've got like emoji photo and whatever, where the proxies are sitting around at, 5.5 megs, which is a little more normal for like low traffic systems. Right, and then we can go through here and kind of sort things by proxy version or filter out. Like let's just find, let's find these lagging ones. Okay, there's just a couple over here that are lagging on that old edge release. So if we were to do an upgrade, to another control plane version, we may want to find these and roll them first so that they're on the latest data plane before we upgrade the control plane. So we want to give you the tools to manage upgrades safely and to make sure you don't have a disconnect between the data plane and the control plane in terms of a version gap. Okay, I see some good questions coming in. There's one about service catalog. I'm gonna address that one in a little bit. There's one about on-premise version of Buoyant Cloud. So far, I've avoided that. It's possible. It's something we could potentially do. The reason I don't like that is because then you kind of have to operate Buoyant Cloud, and one of my goals here is to make it so you operate less, not more, but it's not out of the question. Okay, so the final thing I want to show you in this kind of Linkerd section here, and then we'll move on to the next one, is the TLS breakdown. And this is a very recent feature. I'm super excited about this because one of the core values of Linkerd is, of course, is MTLS, right? Like that's the reason why many people adopt Linkerd, because they want encryption in transit. But Linkerd is so good at providing MTLS that sometimes you don't know that it's there, and it can be hard to know that it's there. So finally, we can answer the question of which traffic in my system is encrypted, which is unencrypted, and which do we not know about. And I actually just wrote a very long guide if anyone is interested in getting into the gory details of MTLS. Maybe I think it's like buoyant.io/MTLS guide, right? Yeah, so if anyone is feeling extremely bored and having trouble falling asleep, you can read through this guide that I just published about how all this stuff works. And I have a little screenshot in here, and I kind of describe this. But let's actually, I think the easiest way to digest this information is let's look at a particular slice here. So let's look just at emoji Voto. And then let's order this by kind of traffic descending. Okay, so now we can start to see some patterns, right? So here's the emoji Voto app we've deployed to one of these clusters, and it's taking a small amount of traffic. And we can see there's actually a couple of different types of traffic here, right? The first is down here, we actually have plain text traffic, right? And this turns out this is pretty common in the system. These are calls, 0.2 RPS is 1 every 5 seconds. So what is hitting this admin point once every 5 seconds? Well, it's the health check. It's the Kubernetes health checks. So once every 5 seconds, this admin port gets hit by the health check, and the Linkerd proxy says okay, and that is not encrypted, and that's kind of okay. The next set of kind of traffic we can see is also to the admin port here, right? But this is actually TLS traffic. Okay, that's this section right here, and this traffic is coming, in this case, from the Buoyant Cloud agent and from the Linkerd Viz Prometheus agent, right? So these are the TLS identities that have been provided for these connections, right? So these are the metric scrapes. In this case, for complicated reasons, I have both the Buoyant Cloud agent and the Linkerd, Linkerd Viz extension installed. So everything is getting scraped twice, and it's a little silly because like most of our traffic, probably is scrapes in aggregate. And then at the top, of course, we actually have our, the actual application traffic, plus this one down here. So we can see that, the web service is taking regular HTTP traffic on port 8080. The emoji service is taking gRPC traffic on port 8080. Everything's encrypted. Linkerd is doing MTLS on both sides. So a lot more to learn here, but the basic concept is, when you add MTLS to a system, a lot of stuff does get encrypted. Some stuff, is MTLS, or some stuff is TLS by your application. We actually don't have an example of that in here. Some stuff is MTLS by the proxy, and then some stuff is plain text. And whether that's okay or whether it's not okay really depends on the specifics of the application. Okay. Oh, thank you. People are saying nice things about the guide. Oh no, but someone says it made them fall asleep. Oh, okay. Well, good. I mean, I guess if that's what you want, I'm glad I could be helpful. Okay. So in aggregate, what we've done so far is we've dived into the kind of Linkerd operational stuff, right? This is the stuff where I want to make it easier. We want to make it easier for you as the operator of Linkerd to understand the state of your cluster, of your service mesh deployment, whether it's healthy or not, and to alert you when things are going wrong or about to go wrong. Let's flip now to the other job that Linkerd does, right? And this is, how do we give you tools to make your platform even better based on all this beautiful Linkerd data? So the very first thing I want to start with, of course, is the fun one, is the topology view, right? So I talked earlier about how Linkerd has service to service, has metrics for service to service communication, right? So one thing we can do is we can actually draw all of your workloads and the relationships between them, right? In this case, what we can see is, kind of things fall into a couple of clusters. First is there's a bunch of workloads at the top that are just not meshed, right? There's things here that, things like the Linkerd identity, well, they actually are meshed. They actually are meshed, but we're doing a little bit of cleanup here, and we're hiding really noisy edges, right? So in reality, something like Prometheus especially is talking to everything, right? So we're going to be a little intelligent. We're going to say, for these really noisy edges, let's just clean those up, right? And let's give you kind of a more intelligent view, all right? And we can see, hey, there's a cluster over here of workloads that all talk to each other. And then there's another cluster over here of workloads that all talk to each other. And actually, I think down here, we can even see our emoji photo application here. And here's the tap, the tap service from the Linkerd Viz extension. So in this case, right, we can see the voting. If you're familiar with emoji photo, there is kind of intentional failures here. We can see that this voting service has a pretty crappy success rate, and the web service in turn is returning these 5xx's, or is handling the 5xx's, and the vote bot, of course, is generating that traffic. Let's see if something is off parameters. Does it show on that graph? I didn't quite understand what you meant by off parameters there. There's another question. Will Buoyant Cloud show the MTLS badge and the topology between services? So yes, yeah. This topology view is like very primitive right now. I mean, it's pretty cool, right? It's pretty neat, and you can do fun stuff like, just show me, just show me the clients and dependencies of this one service. But it is pretty primitive, right? We're just drawing these arrows. We're not giving you any annotation. So in another week, we're actually going to start annotating these arrows as well and give you a lot of details about the nature of the traffic between these two calls. So yeah, that was a great question. Okay, so that's the topology view. It's like a lot more to dive in there. The next view, of course, is our metrics view. Ooh, what happened to my graph? There we are. Okay, so I mentioned that we have, golden metrics and TCP metrics for everything. So here we are. Here's all the metrics in your entire system. Now, for reasons of visual sanity, we're only going to show you 20 at a time. So we have to do a little filtering. So let's actually, let's take a look at. Let's go to our East cluster, right? Let's go to our. Let's pick this namespace, okay, and let's actually expand. Let's look at the past 7 days. Okay. Now we're starting to see some interesting stuff here, all right? I'm going to talk about this in a second. All right, let's go down here. Okay, so here's our, we're now looking at 13 workloads, okay? So we're going to see everything in here. We can see we've got this one service that takes a lot more traffic called Metrics API. All the other ones are sitting down at 1 or 2 RPS. And then we see, we've got TCP metrics, resource usage. You see the sawtooth pattern, which, is very familiar to anyone who runs applications that require memory. And we see this interesting change in the graph here for the number of connections, right? Where something happened over here, right? And after that thing, we have this very flat line. And prior to that, we had a very different profile for this metrics API service. So that great green line at the top is a metrics API workload. So what happened here? Well, if you remember that little graph at the top, this is actually a little graph of workloads, of rollouts. So we're tracking every time a rollout happens on your application, we're tracking that and we're lining it up with your metrics. So now you can go there and you can visually identify. You can say, oh, something changed here. What did that correspond to? Actually, it corresponded to this change in rollouts. And the reason they look like this weird stacked graph is because in our system, we roll out like everything at the same time. We like do a rollout of all 12 pods. I mean, not at the same time, but one after the other. So you get the stack. If you did one workload at a time, it would look a little different. So now we can dive into this and we can say, okay, well, here's that metrics API rollout 6 days ago. Andrew Signer did that. All right, well, what happened here? And we actually give you the ability to annotate those workloads too. So you can, or the rollouts, you can annotate the rollouts too. So you can put all the information that you want into that rollout. And in this case, of course, we have our CI system putting our change log in here, and we're getting very fancy. You can see these links actually go to like GitHub, and so you can get to the actual PR. So what we want to do is, without you having to do a lot of work as the platform owner, We want to make it very easy for you to do things like correlate changes to your cluster to changes in Linkerd metrics, and then give you the ability to annotate stuff and to enrich this, to enrich these rollouts beyond what kind of stock Kubernetes gives you. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. So getting near kind of the end of the guided tour here. But obviously, we've been talking a lot about workloads. All those workloads, are also tracked by Buoyant Cloud. Obviously, like the metrics are showing you kind of a portion of this data. But now we can look at all the workloads across our system, and we can ask interesting things like, okay, which ones are the worst, right? Oops, that was right. Okay, here we can see our 2 emoji photo workloads right now have, the lowest success rate. Everything else is sitting at 100. Which ones take the most traffic across my entire system? Oh, it's that old metrics API. That thing keeps coming up. You can see actually our Linkerd destination, control plane in the west cluster takes a fair amount, and the east cluster as well. And then, you can slice and dice this in various other ways. So for each of these workloads, of course, and now I'm getting closer to the question about service catalogs. For each of these workloads, we want to give you a little home page. So let's take a look at, let me go back to where was emoji photo. So let's filter by the emoji photo. So this page now, right, is now basically the home page for this workload. So if you ever needed a URL that corresponded to a workload that you could send to someone over Slack or whatever, well, now you have one for this workload. And of course, you can dive into the metrics just for this workload and so on and so forth. Right, this is not that exciting because emoji photo hasn't done very much. You can look at the clients and dependencies and, and dig into that information, the same information that you're getting kind of in the topology graph. Okay, so there was a question about service catalogs. So these workloads are, these are things that are live across all of your clusters today, right? And one thing that Buoyant Cloud does is if you have a bunch of workloads that all have the same name, let me see if I can sort by that. Let's find an example here. Something that has multiple versions. Oh, no, that's not going to work. Let me look for, didn't we have that metrics API? Let's see if we have that. Yeah, so you can see we actually have 4 instances of this metrics API workload, right? And that suggests that that's probably the same workload, different versions of it deployed in these different environments. Now, in this case, it's actually not, right? This is actually, I picked a terrible example because it actually is 2 different workloads that happen to have the same name. But what the service catalog does is basically tries to find those similar workloads and compiles them into these bigger entries, right? And here we diverge a bit from Kubernetes, right? Because Kubernetes doesn't really have the service catalog concept. It kind of does. So if we look for, metrics API, let's see here. Yeah, okay, so we were actually smart, and we just picked the ones that were the B Cloud ones, not the Linkerd Viz ones, right? So now we have this very basic service catalog entry, right? And this is very basic, right? There's like nothing in here, but here you could add, we give you the ability to annotate this with like owners or with a description, which you can put in Markdown. This is more kind of like informational, right? What is metrics API? What, does it have a repo somewhere? Who owns this service? Right, this is like kind of database records for the bits and pieces of your system. So there was a question that was, can you add ITSM info, like who to page and run books and bookmarks and stuff like that? Yes, that's right. So this, this is like a very boring page. Let me actually, I think we pre-populate some of these workload entries, service catalog entries for some of the Linkerd stuff. Let me look at this one. Yeah, okay. Wow. So here we tried to get a little fancy, but it is basic right now. If this is something that you're interested in, I would love to hear more. But we give you the ability to dump in Markdown here. And so you can have links to, to docs, you can have run books. We can make this, we have a lot of ideas for how to make this fancier. So if this is something that's interesting to you, then yes, there's a lot more we can do here. So hopefully that answers your questions about the service catalog. Okay, there's a very nice question about, that says, hey, my favorite tab on the dashboard is topology. Okay, great. Can you tell us a bit more about what else is on the roadmap and what other features will come soon? Okay, very good question. I love that. So the most immediate set of things, it's actually, that was a great intro, because the most immediate set of things that we are working on is around this topology view. So I mentioned these arrows right now are pretty basic, right? They just say, hey, this workload had a call to that other workload, right? But in reality, each of these arrows, there's a wealth of information that Linkerd has about it. So we want to give you the ability to dive into one of those arrows and basically say, what is the success rate? What were the actual calls? So if you're familiar with Linkerd service profiles, we can actually give you per route metrics for each of these things. Give you basically the ability to really start filtering and sorting, not just by the workload metrics, but by edge metrics. So hopefully that makes sense. The other thing that, is on two more things I'll mention on the roadmap. The first is, gosh, I lost my train of thought because I was so excited about all this topology stuff. At least one thing I'll mention. Oh yeah, two things. Right, all right. So TLS. So here, what we want to do is, this is kind of a live view of your system, right? But we can actually keep track of this, and we can tell you when this thing changes. So we can give you alerts the same way that we're giving you alerts right now about, this Linkerd control plane component, is dropping in success rate, or it's taking up too much memory, or whatever it is. We can actually start giving you alerts when there's a new type of traffic in your system. So you might want to know, hey, there's a new type of plain text traffic, in your system that you've never seen before. We can give you an alert for that. So that's one thing that's on the short-term roadmap. And the other thing, related to alerts is kind of more generally, right? We're giving you this wealth of metrics information. And we have the ability to give you alerts. Right now, we're alerting you on Linkerd stuff, but we can alert you on these things too. So we should be, you should be able to set an alert here and to say, hey, if the P95 latency for this service, is ever above 300 milliseconds, then send me a note, right? And often, especially at more mature organizations, you have an existing metrics pipeline, you have alerting and all this stuff kind of set up. What we found is that it's still really nice to have something off to the side, that is very Linkerd focused, and that just acts as a backup. Even if you have a fancy, observability solution, it's nice to have this little side channel. It's just going to let you know, just going to send you an email. Hey, we noticed the success rate is dropping. So that's on the roadmap as well. Okay, this question says, how cloud native and Knative is this service at which scale? Oh, interesting. So it's not Knative at all. I don't think, not that I'm aware of. It's extremely cloud native though. So everything about Buoyant Cloud itself, of course, is built on top of Kubernetes and built on top of Linkerd. So that makes us probably the only service mesh creating company that is also running our own service mesh. It's actually been really useful to run our own service mesh in production. That's been great for testing. Turns out, it's much better. You get much better quality control when you have to eat your own dog food. Okay, let's see. How about some more questions? Question about Istio and Kiali. No, there's no Istio, and there will never be Istio. This is for Linkerd. Great question. All right, you want to look at the service catalog again? Let's go take a look at that. And then I see a question about MTLS, so I'll address that in a second. So here's a service catalog. It's like I said, it's a little rudimentary right now. It's like kind of database records built on top of these workloads, but it does do one thing that I think is really, really important, which is all of this data is generated automatically from what it sees on the cluster. So there is no person who has to go in and type all this. I mean, you have to type in the descriptions, right? If you want to annotate this, if you want to annotate this service right, and give it metadata and stuff, right? You have to type that in, but the fact that those workloads live on your cluster, that's all done automatically, right? So this the catalog aspect is done based on actual data. Okay, can the service catalog be extended with more data? So the answer is yes. Basically, there's the easy way, and then there's the less easy way. The easy way, of course, is to like type stuff into that little box on screen. That's not to everyone's liking. The other way you can put data into the system is through Kubernetes Annotations. So if you can annotate your workloads with this data, we can pull those in and we can start fleshing out your service catalog. And so if you have an automated way of doing that, then you can automate some of this. But I'm definitely open to other ideas. I'm getting from these questions that service catalog is really interesting to people. So yeah, I would love to hear more about what would be interesting to you in here. Okay, there was a question about MTLS and ingress. So basically, that's probably more of a Linkerd question than a Buoyant Cloud question. Basically, the way normally the way it works is your ingress controller is doing its own TLSing, right? So it has some public, if it's a public-facing cluster, it's going to have some public TLS sort, that's signed by VeriSign or whatever, right? And that is outside of Linkerd's MTLS. So you would mesh that pod, you mesh your ingress controller pod. Traffic would come in, that TLS traffic would come in. It would go to your ingress controller, which would terminate that TLS. And then any traffic from the ingress controller to an internal service would then be MTLS'd by Linkerd. So you'll actually see that application traffic in here. You'll see it as like application initiated TLS, but the MTLSing itself will be handled by Linkerd, and that'll just be for the internal traffic. Okay. Let's see, there's a question about performance snapshots. Clearly see the difference between setups and Linkerd versions. Interesting. Performance snapshots. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's right. So we don't have a great way right now of saying, hey, these two versions of this workload, were deployed under different conditions, and here's the RPS graph. You might be able to do that. You might be able to do that on the metrics page. Interesting question though. Okay, there's a question about the little broken heart in voting. I was hoping you weren't going to ask me about that. Okay, all right, let's go back. So that was in the service catalog. Yeah, so one thing that I have skipped over here is our Slo implementation, and basically that's corresponding here to this thing here. The reason I've skipped over it is because it's a little rough. Right, so we have this idea of SLOs. We want to give you, like, if you're familiar with SLOs, it's basically a mechanism for taking Linkerd metrics and turning those into or taking, I guess it doesn't have to be Linkerd metrics, but taking any metric and turning that into these kind of bigger objectives around, over the course of a week, what percentage of failed requests actually is okay. Right, and we can do that actually pretty easily for you, right? At least based on Linkerd metrics. So we can give you the ability to add an SLO in a way that is, basically a set of dropdowns, right? So you can say, 95% of all requests over the past 30 days are served, successfully or in 50 milliseconds or less, right? And you can just add an SLO and it'll start tracking it. The reason why I kind of was skipping over it was because there's one or two weirdnesses that we're still working on fleshing out on making this applicable to every workload in the system. So we're very close, but yeah. So that's your question was, what is this broken heart? It's basically because this thing is currently, Emoji Voto is out of SLO because we set up an SLO that was very high, and Emoji Voto is like 80% successful. Okay, so hopefully that that answered your question. Okay, there's another question about events. Yeah, so we do have this kind of events table here that I didn't go through because it's kind of the dumping ground for like everything, like every change that happens in the system. Every thing that we detect is recorded as an event, right? So all of those, when we saw this Linkerd overview, right? And we looked at these Linkerd events. These are all the Linkerd specific events in here, right? These are things around the cluster, around the certificate, or around the control plane. When we looked at the rollouts, those were all events as well. So basically an event in Buoyant Cloud is like some kind of change or notification that we've seen in the system, and we just keep a record of it. So you can do interesting stuff with that, right? For example, we can go to our events page, we can remove, let's do, instead of looking at the Linkerd events, let's look at just the code rollouts, right? And then let's see, can we do, let's see, don't want to do severity. Let's do something like that. And there's ways basically of getting kind of a running change log for here's all the changes in my system, right? And let's pick a particular pick a particular application here. Let's look at that, something like that. And okay, there we go. We should see all the rollouts that happen to this system across all the clusters over time, and you can turn that into a change log. So basically, it's a dumping ground for like every change that we have in there. Hopefully that answers your question. Can events be forwarded to something like Sumo? Potentially, yes. We don't have that in there today, but yeah, we could definitely do that. I think the rollout events would be an interesting one, especially because, like I said, aligning those with metrics is where things get really interesting. Let me go back to the example I had there. I think we were looking at this namespace and then looking over the past 7 days. Yeah, so getting a view like this, I think, is kind of that's where things get really interesting, because that's when you can correlate the events and the metrics into one thing that is visually, as a human, you can say, hey, something really interesting happened here, and hopefully it was something that you expected, and if not, then like you can dig into it. All right, I'll do 1 or 2 more questions if anyone has them, and then we may start wrapping it up. All right, let me go back to the final slide here, which I think just says thank you or something. Oh, there's Q&A. Okay, gotta have a slide for that. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time here today. Buoyant Cloud is free for everyone. There's a free tier that, like I said, is useful and does stuff. So if you have a Linkerd cluster, even if it's just a toy one, please attach it either using the Buoyant Cloud extension or by just going to buoyant.io/cloud and like following the instructions. And feel free to send me an email. It's a really exciting time for us here at Buoyant Land and in Linkerd Land. And I really appreciate you all being here today and spending this time with me. Thank you so much.